When assuming the role of President of the United States, one does not only assume the role of presidency. Other roles that they inherit are the role of the chief executive, the party leader, the chief diplomat, and the commander-in-chief.
Richard Nixon won the election this time, where 8 years ago he lost it.
The President of the United States. Mr. Chairman, delegates to this convention, my fellow Americans, 4 years ago, standing in this very place, I proudly accepted your nomination for President of the United States.
As chief diplomat, the President serves as the chief representative of our nation in the foreign sphere. Directing our foreign policy, the President is able to make informal agreements with other nations, as well as appoint ambassadors in order to maintain a strong United States presence in allied nations.
As chief diplomat, Nixon was granted the formal powers to establish relationships and executive agreements with the heads of other nations, or otherwise make treaties. He was also able to appoint ambassadors and utilize the War Powers Act within its guidelines. Informally, Nixon could not only establish relations, but set the tone of those relations, whether they will be hostile or friendly, as well as influence who Congress is likely to sign a treaty with and can make sure that Congress does not get ahead of him by setting the agenda. Granted these powers, Nixon was also placed under various checks. In making treaties, which is often more a congressional power, the president's negotiation must be approved and finalized by Congress, who makes treaties official. As for the appointment of ambassadors, Senate checks the president's appointments for final approval. Nixon was not very well known as a chief diplomat, but his involvements were crucial nonetheless. The triangular diplomacy was a restoration of international order. In 1968, the Soviet Union achieved nuclear missile parity with the United States, and relations between the Soviet Union and Communist China were so bad that the two nations fought in border clashes. The Soviets and the Chinese clashing were seeking American support against each other. Nixon believed that international peace could be achieved by using the United States as a power broker in conflicts between the two communist giants. Triangular diplomacy between the three nations was to balance international power and secure world peace. In order to express a symbol of peace to the Chinese amidst crisis, Nixon received an invite to send Harry Kissinger and the U.S. ping pong team on April 6, 1971, for an all-expense paid to the People's Republic. Time magazine called it the Ping Heard Around the World. 9 players, 4 officials, and 2 spouses stepped across a bridge from Hong Kong to the Chinese mainland, ushering in an era of ping-pong diplomacy. They were the first group of Americans allowed into China since the communist takeover in 1949. Ping-pong diplomacy was one of the first public hints of improved U.S.-China relations.
As you know, the Soviet-American talks on limiting nuclear arms have been deadlocked for over a year. As a result of negotiations involving the highest level of both governments, I am announcing today a significant development in breaking the deadlock.
In the power of negotiating treaties, Nixon devised 2 that will both inhibit the number of nuclear weapons held by the Cold War powers of the U.S. and Russia. The first was known as SALT I, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which froze the number of strategic ballistic missile launchers at existing levels and only allowed new weaponry vehicles when others were replaced. SALT led to the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which imposed limitation on the number of anti-ballistic missile systems used in defending areas against nuclear weapons. Nixon may not have been known as our most prolific diplomatic president, but nonetheless he had great significance in diffusing tensions between the U.S. and Communist China as well as Russia.
The President, as party leader, works to further the platform of his or her party, supports candidates of his or her party, and creates a unified party that will remain strong after his or her presidency has ended.
The role of party leader is perhaps the least structured of the roles of president. In the past century, the role of the party leader has changed. In the words of Robert Mason, a professor at the University of Edinburgh, points out that while Nixon was not very involved as party leader, he is in fact one of the best in his field. Mason continues.
His attitude towards the party was seen as neglectful at best, destructive at worst. It was clear that Nixon reveled in the details of electoral politics as far as his own position was concerned, but it seemed equally clear that he had little concern for the political fortunes of his party at large. Among the most partisan of American politicians during his earlier career, Nixon seemed to shrug off this partisan past when he reached the White House in 1969. But this understanding of Nixon's relationship with the Republican Party is in some respects misleading. Although it is true that his record provides significant examples of presidential neglect of the party, it also contains equally significant examples of presidential concern about the party's future.
The main roles of the party leader are to keep the party united and serve as an advocate to candidates and leaders in the party. The president is responsible for furthering the party platform and helping to ensure the election or re-election of members of his or her political party. Nixon, as all presidents, helped in the campaigns of Republicans, but was known as being a relatively awkward man and did not excel in gaining public opinion. He won the presidency with the support of the nation, thus enhancing the power of the Republican Party. However, his failures in other realms of the presidency did not bode well for the Republican Party over time.
As Commander-in-Chief, the President's main job is to command the armed forces and make foreign policy. As President, Richard Nixon successfully pulled America out of the Vietnam War and somewhat made peace with other nations.
When you assume the role of President, you take on the role of Commander-in-Chief. That means you are in charge of the armed forces and making foreign policy. Nixon had a lot to deal with when it came to foreign policy and war, seeing as he took office in the height of both the Vietnam and the Cold Wars. America was disliked by many countries, and America was on thin ice with countries such as China, Cuba, the Soviet Union, and North Vietnam. Nixon made a good relationship with China through a series of negotiations. China and America were finally at peace. Nixon tried to crack down on Cuba after JFK's failed Bay of Pigs attack. However, the Cubans were afraid that America would attack them again, so they reached out to their allies, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union got in contact with Nixon, and they came to the decision that Nixon would leave Cuba alone. When it came to the Soviet Union, Nixon made a great deal of progress. He crusaded for nuclear peace, and his wish was granted, as we saw through the SALT and the anti-ballistic missile treaty that we talked about earlier. Although Nixon did not make complete peace with the Soviets, he came close and he got the nations on better terms than they had been before. Due to Nixon's great progress with the Soviet Union and China, he was able to convince both nations to cut down their support to North Vietnam. When Nixon took office, the United States was at war with North Vietnam, and shortly after he took office, Nixon concluded that the war could simply not be won, and he would do everything possible and in his power to end it as soon as he could. Nixon had different methods and theories on how he could win the war, and one of them was the Madman theory. The Madman theory was basically the U.S. would excessively bomb Vietnam and parts of Cambodia in hopes of intimidating them to surrender. But when that didn't work, Nixon tried negotiating. He tried to negotiate peace with North Vietnam, but that failed too. Finally, Nixon accepted that the war could not be won at all, and that he would engage in his last operation, Vietnamization. Vietnamization was when the U.S. armed forces taught the people of South Vietnam how to fight for themselves. They organized them into troops and had them fight North Vietnam whilst the U.S. took their troops out. The U.S. didn't win the Vietnam War, but Nixon did a better job than most would in accepting this fact and focusing on getting the troops out safely rather than winning. Although there aren't many checks on the role of Commander-in-Chief, there are two main ones. Before the president can declare war on a country, the Senate must give its approval, and after the president signs a treaty, it must be approved by the Senate before it's valid.
As the chief executive expert, one studies the methods by which the president uses his powers as head of the executive branch, or, in the case of Richard Nixon, misuses them.
As chief executive, Nixon was tasked to ensure that laws were executed faithfully. However, the chief executive also has several unofficial powers. One of these is to make cabinet appointments, another is to make executive orders, and a third is to enforce his executive privilege. President Nixon created several important executive orders, one of which was the formation and creation of a seal for the Environmental Protection Agency in June of 1970. And another was the establishment of rules for classification and declassification of government information. These powers are kept in check by Congress, which keeps a list of these executive orders and ensures that they are lawfully executed and that they are constitutional. President Nixon is widely remembered for his role in the Watergate scandal.
Senate investigation revealed that President Nixon was involved in the Watergate scandal.
In my view, an impeachable offense. I was concerned about whether or not the other side was bucking us. I cut off one arm, then cut off the other. No, I don't interpret that way at all. I can't recall that conversation. I said things that were not true. I'd run myself.
Why didn't you stop? Some people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
This moment forever changed the nation's perception of the office of the president. He was no longer an infallible leader, but rather someone who should not always be trusted. Men, under the orders of the Republican Party, broke into the Watergate Hotel in order to lay surveillance equipment in the Democratic Party's National Committee offices. The break-in, however, was detected, and slowly information was uncovered by reporters, unraveling cover-ups that went all the way up to the president. To prove Nixon's guilt, potentially incriminating tapes from the Oval Office were required. Nixon denied access to these tapes by enforcing his executive privilege. This began an unprecedented battle between the executive branch and the entire rest of the government. Watergate Special Counsel Archibald Cox subpoenaed the tapes, but was promptly fired by Nixon. In April 1974, the battle was still raging, and Nixon released 1,200 pages of transcripts to placate the investigation. However, the Supreme Court ruled on July 24th of the same year that Nixon had to release the entirety of the tapes, not just a selection of them. And the House Judiciary Committee ruled in favor of Nixon's impeachment on July 27th of 1974. Then, the smoking gun tape ended it all. A tape was released that was unquestionable evidence that Nixon was informed of the break-in and had improved measures to hide it from the world. He was informed that there was simply not enough votes to keep him from being impeached, and shortly afterwards he resigned. This is the farthest executive privilege has ever been stretched. However, it also displays the checks placed on the president in the forms of public opinion and the impeachment process.
The responsibilities that are assumed when one takes the role of the president do not end with roles such as party leader, commander-in-chief, chief diplomat, and chief executive. They extend to roles including chief magistrate, chief legislator, chief of state, and stand beneath an endless array of expectations. Success in one is not success in all, as demonstrated through President Nixon.